Vladimir Putin has a problem he cannot escape, and for the first time since he started this invasion, the numbers are making that undeniable. 89,000 Russian soldiers gone in 3 months. Just the first quarter of 2026, January, February, March. And Russia has lost nearly 90,000 of its own people in a war that Putin still refuses to acknowledge as a war. A war he is losing so badly, so completely, so irreversibly that the mathematics alone should be enough to bring it to an end. But it isn't because Putin keeps sending more and Ukraine keeps killing them. And here's the thing that makes this story even more troubling than that number. The 89,000 figure. That's not the worst quarter Russia has seen. It gets darker than that. And the reason it's going to get even darker from here, the reason this is genuinely a war-ending catastrophe for Putin, isn't just the death toll. It's what's unfolding behind the death toll. The thing buried underneath the casualty statistics that nobody is discussing enough. We're going to go through all of it, the numbers, what they mean, what they're concealing, and the devastating decision that Putin is now being pushed toward. A decision he has spent years desperately trying to dodge. Because once he makes it, everything shifts. Inside Russia, on the front lines, and for the future of this war, stay with us. Let's begin with the headline figure and make sure the full weight of it truly registers. 89,000 Russian casualties in 3 months. That number was reported by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at a press conference at the end of March 2026. It represents confirmed losses, soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or otherwise removed from combat across January, February, and March of this year. Break it down monthly and you get an average of 29,666 Russian soldiers lost every single month. That is roughly 1,000 soldiers per day, every day for 90 days without pause. But here's a critical piece of context. January and February are cold months. Winter in Ukraine doesn't stop the war, but it does slow offensive operations. Ground conditions make large-scale armored advances more difficult. Drone effectiveness can be reduced in certain weather patterns. The pace of Russian assault operations during those 2 months would have been lower than what Russia builds up to in spring. March was different. March marked the beginning of Russia's long-anticipated spring offensive, the moment each year when Russian commanders push their forces harder, launch more assaults, and attempt to secure the territorial gains they have been working toward all winter. March is when Russia escalates, which means March almost certainly recorded the highest single-month casualty figure of the three. What that tells us is straightforward. If the average across 3 months, including 2 slower winter months, is nearly 30,000 per month, and March was above that average, then the spring offensive has already driven Russia's monthly losses past 30,000. And the spring offensive is only just beginning. What we are looking at right now, 89,000 in a quarter, is Russia at the lower end of what 2026 is going to produce. It only gets worse from here. Now here's where the story becomes a layer more disturbing because 89,000 confirmed casualties in 3 months sounds catastrophic, and it is. But believe it or not, the quarter before it was worse. Between November 2025 and January 2026, Russia's losses climbed to almost 100,000, nearly 6 figures in 3 months. That occurred as Putin's forces attempted to finish their push against Pokrovsk, a strategically vital city in eastern Ukraine, and found themselves increasingly cut off in freezing winter conditions that transformed the battlefield into a killing field. Ukraine's drone networks operate with particular effectiveness against troops attempting to hold static positions in open terrain. Ukraine's specialized search and destroy squads, formed specifically to counter Russia's infantry infiltration tactics, were tearing through Russian formations with brutal efficiency. Almost 100,000 casualties in 3 months, then 89,000 the next quarter. So in the most narrow technical sense, and we use these words with complete awareness of how absurd they sound, 89,000 is actually a marginal improvement for Russia. That is the reality of where this war stands. Russia's best-case quarterly casualty figure in 2026 is 89,000 people. And the territorial gains that all of those deaths are purchasing, that's where this story moves from tragic to almost unthinkable. Let's look at the math that Putin would rather you never see. Consider all of 2025. According to United 24 media, Russia burned through approximately 400,000 of its soldiers across the entire year. 400,000 people. In return for that sacrifice, Russia captured 4,836 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That's 1,074 square miles. Ukraine's total territory is approximately 603,000 square kilometers. The territory Russia still needs to seize to achieve the stated objectives of its so-called special military operation represents more than 80% of Ukraine's free land. At the rate Russia captured territory in 2025 with 400,000 soldiers lost, it would take approximately 100 years to complete the conquest. A century. Putin, who is 72 years old, would need to live to 172, and whoever comes after him would need to maintain the exact same pace of sacrifice for decades beyond that. That figure alone should settle the debate about whether Russia can win this war. But it gets more specific. The Institute for the Study of War tracked Russian territorial gains between October 2025 and March 2026, a 6-month window covering both the punishing late 2025 push and the opening of the 2026 spring offensive. In that period, Russia took approximately 1,300 square kilometers of Ukraine, just under 745 square miles. 6 months of combat, tens of thousands of soldiers lost every month. Compare that to the same 6-month period a year earlier, October 2024 through March 2025, when Russia captured approximately 2,160 square kilometers, or about 1,048 square miles. Even that figure was already a damning indictment of Russia's military efficiency. But the more recent number is dramatically lower. Russia's rate of territorial advance is slowing considerably, even as its casualty rate stays catastrophically high. Now put the numbers together. If we take the 89,000 casualties from the first quarter of 2026 and the approximately 100,000 from the November to January period, we have 189,000 across those 6 months. But January appears in both. So we subtract approximately 30,000 to remove the overlap, giving us 159,000. Add Ukraine's confirmed figure of 25,000 Russian soldiers killed in October 2025 alone, and you arrive at approximately 184,000 Russian casualties across the 6-month Institute for the Study of War window. 184,000 casualties, 745 square miles of Ukrainian territory gained. Run those numbers. Russia is losing just under 247 soldiers for every single square mile of Ukrainian territory it takes. 247 soldiers per square mile in a country where Russia still needs to capture the vast majority of the land it is after. This is not a military campaign. This is a demographic catastrophe playing out in slow motion. And the pace is not slowing down, it is accelerating. On March 17, 2026, Russia shattered its own grim record for single-day casualties in 2026. In just 24 hours, 1,710 Russian soldiers were removed from the fight. Alongside them, 230 vehicles and fuel tankers destroyed, 29 artillery systems lost. That 1,710 figure is a sharp jump from the 700 to 900 daily losses Russia was absorbing earlier in the year. And it is not an outlier. It is the trend pointing forward. Here's a comparison that puts that number into human perspective. The United States lost approximately 2,400 soldiers during its entire 20-year war in Afghanistan. Russia is now losing more soldiers every 2 days than America lost across 2 decades of the most prolonged military engagement in U.S. history. Russia also carries its own Afghanistan in its historical memory. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the USSR lost approximately 15,000 soldiers over a decade of grueling combat. That conflict was considered a catastrophic failure that helped bring down the Soviet Union. Russia is now losing that same number of soldiers roughly every 2 weeks in Ukraine. And keep in mind, Putin spent years telling the Russian people that this is a special military operation, a limited action, a brief correction, not a war. The casualty rates of a generation-defining military disaster are being sustained, while the official position holds that nothing particularly serious is taking place. For the people being sent to die, that distinction means absolutely nothing. The 4 days leading up to March 23rd gave a preview of what the spring offensive is going to look like at full intensity. In those 4 days, Russia launched over 600 assault attempts against Ukrainian positions across the front. The price, 690 Russian soldiers. That works out to approximately 1,322 Russian casualties per day, above the previous daily average but below the record single-day figure. Multiply 1,522 daily casualties by 30 days, and you arrive at approximately 45,600 Russian losses per month. That figure is within reach of the threshold that Ukrainian President Zelensky has publicly named as the breaking point, the level of attrition that would compel Putin to bring this war to an end. Zelensky has set a target of 50,000 Russian casualties per month by the end of 2026. Ukraine is currently running approximately 20,000 short of that monthly target based on confirmed figures. But confirmed figures are a floor, not a ceiling. And as the spring offensive intensifies, as more Russian assault waves break against Ukrainian defenses, as Ukraine's drone networks grow and its strike capability expands, that gap between 30,000 per month and 50,000 per month is narrowing. The direction of movement is clear, and Putin has no response to it. But here's where we arrive at the deeper crisis, the one we mentioned at the start, because the casualty rate, as devastating as it is, has been a reality of this war for years. Russia has been absorbing enormous losses since 2022 and pressing on regardless. So what makes the current situation genuinely different? What makes this the turning point? The answer is four words: arrivals minus departures negative. For 4 consecutive months, December 2025 through March 2026, Russia's military has been losing more soldiers than it is bringing in. For the first time since Putin launched his invasion, the flow of new fighters is not keeping pace with the flow of casualties. Russia's manpower pool is shrinking in real time, month over month, for the first time in this war. United 24 Media confirmed this figure and what it means. Russia set a recruitment target of 409,000 new soldiers for 2026, an already enormous number that would represent a substantial mobilization effort. But in the first quarter, Russia reached only 22% of that target when it needed to hit 25% to remain on track. That is a shortfall that grows every month. And that 409,000 target was already built on a shaky assumption that confirmed casualties represent total casualties. They do not. As we discussed, Ukraine's head of unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, has stated directly that 20% of Ukrainian strikes during the first quarter of 2026 cannot be fully confirmed in terms of Russian soldiers killed. Ukraine can verify that strikes reach their targets. What it cannot always determine is the precise death toll when an explosion kills soldiers through shrapnel and blast pressure rather than direct impact, or when soldiers die beneath rubble, or when they are killed in ways that cannot be captured on reconnaissance drone footage. The actual Russian casualty count for the first quarter of 2026 is almost certainly above 89,000. By how much is genuinely unclear but higher, which means the gap between Russia's recruitment capacity and its casualty rate is even wider than the official numbers indicate. And Ukraine is actively working to stretch that gap further. Zelensky's 50,000 per month target is not wishful thinking. It is an operational objective. Ukraine is building toward it with purpose, expanding its drone strike capacity, sharpening its artillery coordination, and hitting Russian troop concentrations with growing precision. What we are watching in real time is Russia's manpower equation falling into deficit, and Ukraine deliberately working to deepen that deficit. So how is Russia reacting? The responses are telling, and some of them are so desperate they would read like dark comedy if the consequences were not so grave. The method Russia has depended on throughout this war to drive volunteer recruitment is simple: money. Sign-up bonuses that far exceed anything most Russians could earn in years of civilian work. In some regions, those bonuses climbed as high as $40,000. For a country where average wages sit well below Western levels, that kind of money was enough to persuade tens of thousands of men to sign the contract and board the bus to Ukraine. That approach is now breaking down, not just because Russia is falling short of its recruitment targets, but because the regions that were funding those bonuses are running out of money to pay them. Multiple Russian regions are now slashing their sign-up bonuses. The financial pipeline that kept volunteers moving is drying up, and there is nothing ready to replace it. So Russia is turning to more forceful methods. And some of what is already happening on the ground shows just how far the Kremlin is prepared to go. In the Ryazan region of Russia, a local governor issued an order requiring businesses to participate in military recruitment. Any company in that region with between 150 and 500 employees now faces a September deadline to hand over the names of workers they consider suitable for deployment to Ukraine. Companies with between 150 and 300 employees must provide 2 names. Those with between 300 and 500 must provide 5. Any business that refuses faces a fine of 1 million rubles, roughly $12,000. Read that again. Russian employers are being directed by their regional government to identify their own staff for military service. Refuse and you pay. This is not voluntary recruitment. This is the state reaching into the workplace to conscript workers through their employers with financial punishment for noncompliance. That is one approach. Here is another. Russia's Education and Science Minister, Valery Falkov, has instructed the country's universities to persuade 2% of their student populations to enlist for military service. If those instructions are carried out, the result would be an influx of approximately 44,000 new soldiers from university campuses alone, rising to around 76,000 when colleges are counted alongside universities. Consider what this means on the ground. Russia is now running military recruitment drives inside its own institutions of higher learning. The students who are meant to become engineers, doctors, economists, and scientists, the people who would be responsible for rebuilding Russia's economy after this war, are being treated as a reserve manpower pool for the front lines. And the economic damage from all of this does not exist separately. It compounds everything else. Russia is already caught in a serious labor crisis driven largely by the war itself. The military has pulled millions of working-age men out of the civilian workforce. Businesses are struggling to fill positions. More than 20 factories in Russia's Leningrad region alone have moved to 3-day work weeks, not because orders have dried up, but because there simply are not enough workers to keep full operations running. Putin has set in motion a cycle of economic self-destruction. The war drains the labor pool. The labor shortage cripples industry. Crippled industry produces less tax revenue and less economic output. That reduces the money available to sustain the war, including the sign-up bonuses that were drawing in volunteers, which forces Russia toward more coercive recruitment, which pulls more workers from the economy, which deepens the labor crisis. Russia is not just losing soldiers in Ukraine. It is eating its own economic future in the process. And now Putin is being driven toward the option he has spent 3 years doing everything possible to avoid, the option that more than any other single move could put his grip on power at risk inside Russia: mobilization. In 2025, Putin signed legislation that fundamentally restructured Russia's conscription framework. Previously, Russia ran 2 annual draft periods to bring in new conscripts for a year of mandatory service. The new legislation converted that into a year-round system, meaning Russia can now call up anyone between the ages of 18 and 30 at any time for a year-long service period without waiting for a set draft window. The Kremlin has publicly stated that conscript numbers will not rise. Do not accept that at face value. The legal groundwork for expanded conscription is already laid. The machinery to move from voluntary recruitment to compulsory mobilization is being quietly assembled. And according to United 24 media, the disappointing results of the Defense Ministry's recent recruitment drives are pushing Putin toward a limited and rolling reserve call-up arrangement, the kind of mechanism that would let Russia edge toward full mobilization without making a single dramatic announcement. This is dangerous ground for Putin politically. The last time he called a partial mobilization, September 2022, the reaction inside Russia was instant and severe. Hundreds of thousands of Russians left the country virtually overnight. The announcement triggered demonstrations across Russian cities. Men of military age crossed every available border by car, on foot, by whatever means they could find. The images were striking and deeply humiliating for a leader who had spent months insisting the operation was proceeding as planned. Putin understands what mobilization costs him. He has spent nearly 3 years steering the war in ways designed specifically to avoid setting off that kind of domestic reaction again. Volunteer recruitment with generous bonuses was the mechanism that let him keep the war machine running without having to openly admit that Russia is facing a military emergency demanding national sacrifice. That mechanism is now broken. The bonuses are being cut, the targets are not being met. The arrivals to departures balance has been negative for 4 months running, and Ukraine is actively working to push the monthly casualty figure toward 50,000. Putin does not want to mobilize, not because he has any concern for the men who would be drafted, but because he grasps with the cold political instinct that has kept him in power for 25 years that mobilization is a confession. It is a confession that this is a real war, that Russia is not winning it, that the sacrifices he has asked of the Russian people are not coming to an end anytime soon, and that the number of people he intends to demand them from is about to grow significantly. He has spent years assuring Russia's population that everything is under control. Mobilization is the moment that assurance becomes impossible to sustain. And while Russia tears itself apart trying to scrape together enough soldiers to keep this war alive, Ukraine is not standing still. Ukraine closed 2025 producing approximately 4 million drones per year. 4 million. That is not an exaggeration. The drone-saturated kill zones that have ground Russian advances into dust are expanding, tripling their effective reach as Ukraine fields new medium-range strike drones capable of hitting further behind Russian lines with greater accuracy and heavier payloads. At the same time, Ukraine's long-range strikes are penetrating deep into Russian territory, oil refineries, fuel export terminals, military supply networks. Every successful strike chips away at Russia's financial capacity to fund the war and degrades the supply chain keeping the front lines operational. There is erosion in the rear and death at the front. And both are getting worse at the same time. The spring offensive Russia launched is costing its soldiers at rates already pushing its recruitment system past the point of sustainability, and Ukraine is building toward a monthly attrition level that analysts believe would be enough to force Russia to make a choice, negotiate, or collapse. That choice is approaching. The numbers guarantee it. The only question remaining is how many more tens of thousands of soldiers Putin is willing to spend before he is made to face it. Let's bring this together because the full picture is one that needs to be stated plainly. Russia has confirmed 89,000 casualties in the first 3 months of 2026, and that number is almost certainly too low. Its rate of territorial gain is falling even as its casualty rate holds at catastrophic levels, with 247 soldiers lost for every square mile captured. Its recruitment system is breaking down for the first time since the invasion started, with 4 straight months of negative arrivals to departures balance. Regional governments are compelling employers to put forward the names of their own workers for military deployment. The education minister is directing universities to hand over student recruits. Sign-up bonuses are being reduced as regional funds dry up. And Putin is being nudged step by reluctant step toward a new mobilization that could shake the political structure he has spent 25 years constructing. On the other side of that ledger, Ukraine is producing 4 million drones a year, widening its strike coverage, hitting Russian infrastructure hundreds of miles from the front, and closing in on the 50,000 per month casualty rate that Zelensky has identified as the threshold that ends this war. The path ahead is not uncertain. Russia is not winning this war. Russia cannot keep fighting this war at its current tempo without dismantling its own military, gutting its own economy, and fracturing its own society in the process. The 89,000 figure from the first quarter of 2026 is not the peak of this crisis. It is the starting point. Things are going to deteriorate further for Putin from here, and he has no strong options remaining, only less damaging ones. And the least damaging option available to him, the one the numbers are driving him toward, is the one he is most desperate not to take. This is States News. If this analysis matters to you, make sure you are subscribed because we are going to keep following every development in this war as it unfolds. The numbers do not lie. And right now, they are telling a story that Vladimir Putin cannot afford for the world to hear.